Welcome to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al, the podcast where we dig deep into the practices, innovations and ideas that shape modern farming in Gippsland and beyond. I'm your host, Alistair McCaleb, and today we've got a special guest who's no stranger to the paddock or the boardroom. Joining us is Trevor Caithness. He's a beef producer and cropper in East Gippsland. He is also the volunteer CEO of Gippsland Ag Group. And in 2024, Trevor and Karen were named the Beef Farmer of the Year by the Weekly Times. Trevor's journey from South Gippsland to East Gippsland has been marked by innovation, resilience and a commitment to sustainable farming practices. He's not only leading the charge in beef production, but he also completed a prestigious Nuffield Scholarship, focusing on alternative methods for nutrient applications on farms. In this episode, Trevor shares his insights on the critical role of trace elements on coastal regions of Australia, particularly here in Gippsland. He'll explain why balancing our soils is key to ensuring both our livestock and crops thrive. Drawing from his global travels and hands-on experience, Trevor offers practical advice on how to improve soil health, increase productivity and ultimately boost farm profitability. Whether you're a seasoned farmer, a budding agriculturalist, or just curious about what makes Gippsland farming unique, this episode is packed with valuable takeaways. So, let's dive in and hear from Trevor Caithness on how balancing soils can lead to better pastures, healthier livestock, and a more profitable farm. Welcome, Trevor, to Digging Deeper. Thanks for coming in this afternoon and having a chat to us about a whole range of things. We're going to start actually. A lot of people do know you in this area, but some won't. Caithness Pastoral, can you just tell us about that operation, where you are and what you actually do?
Thanks, Al. Yeah, great to be here this afternoon. Caithness Pastoral is a business that my wife, Karen, and I started in 2023, and that's actually when we shifted up here into this East Gippsland region.
2023?
2003.
2003.
Yeah, sorry, we got off to a bad start.
No, that's all right.
And so from that 2003 start, we had a holding there, which our family had for a couple of years, because we're originally from South Gippsland, so a little place called Coonawarra, and that's where I farmed with my parents and my brother for probably the first 20 years of my farming career.
A bit of a shock coming to East Gippsland then.
Yeah, so it was always something that we'd considered perhaps as not our place of residence, but circumstances changed within our family business, and we had a family business that had grown very successfully over a 20-year period, and we got to the point where we had different family members that were probably wanting to go at different speeds and different directions. So Karen and I decided it was probably a good time to exit out, and yeah, we took on, we had at that stage about 400 hectares just south of Bairnsdale, and so we took on that and farmed on from there.
Yep. So the operation as it currently is now, it's beef and cropping?
Yeah, so it's a beef operation that's running about sort of 800 breeding cows, and then all the progeny from those breeding cows are either replacement heifers put back into the herd, or they're finished cattle that we actually we fatten them, have them up to probably about 500 kilos live weight in that 15 to 16 months age bracket, and then directed straight into one of the major supermarkets.
Yeah. And the cropping side of your business?
The cropping side has probably scaled back quite a bit in the last few years, because the cropping side predominantly only grows barley now. We did do a lot of cropping in the early days when we were developing country, developing properties, and that was sort of our development tool to get some quick probably agronomic improvements to the soil and quick cash flow, and hence then the aim to get them across into livestock production after that.
Yep. No, very good. And so you obviously do both those operations quite well, because last year you actually awarded a fairly prestigious award. Can you tell us about that? Yeah,
so last year we'd been nominated for Beef Farmer of the Year, which is the Coles Weekly Times Farmer Awards. And yes, we got down to down to Melbourne to the big event, and we knew we were one of the entrants, and could have just about knocked us over with a feather when our name was called that we were the winners. So that's been something that is, we're not out there type people as far as that sort of promotion, but it's been great to see some recognition of what we do. We're very different than most in our region here because we not only breed, but we fatten and finish everything within the business. So we're not really that interested in producing weaner steers or anything like that. We really want to take that genetic potential of those animals through to a kill weight, and that's not always easy in our sort of unreliable type East Gippsland environment. But I think that's probably one of the things that was seen by the judges, our ability to produce a commodity week in, week out, 12 months of the year, perhaps no matter what the seasonal conditions are doing.
Interesting little point there that a lot of people here in East Gippsland particularly can't take their whole progeny to fattening weights. What have you done on farm to actually sort of future-proof that operation? Because there's some interesting things that happen out at your farm. I've been out there a few times.
Yes, look, we've always been very passionate about holding reasonable fodder reserves, for one. So we'll have normally, hopefully, 1,000 tonne of pit silage put in a big silage bunker. So it's a concrete floored, concrete walled bunker. So that keeps silage in great condition for many, many years. We're being barley producers. One of the reasons I love growing barley is because it gives us a lot of straw to bale. Yeah. So when we bale a lot of straw, we've always got what I call a dry cow feed. So the straw being of limited food value, but just fantastic. We're weaning calves at the moment off cows. Those cows will just run around and clean a few rough pastures up, and then they'll literally live on straw until they calve again in July. And I suppose a lot of the other stuff that we've done is just soil work. So we've done a lot of soil work, which has basically not only improved the health of the soil, but it improves the health and the doing ability of the progeny you're producing off them. And then once you get that soil work done, it then opens up all those other plants that you can grow within your pastures, like dry land lucerne. So lucerne's just a phenomenal pasture crop for us. It's always within our pasture mixes. Never will 100% of the paddock actually be suited to lucerne and all the paddock grow, but we tend to find all of the lighter sandy ridges. The lucerne just gets well established in those areas. And so hence you get to this time of the year and it's really dry and there's not much productivity.
Apart from the green lucerne that's everywhere in your place.
Apart from the green lucerne. Yeah. And as long as you've got that rotation going around, those stock, have always got that green pick of lucerne around us. So I think that's been lucerne's been a pretty important part of us being able to produce stock 12 months of the year.
Yep. Now, just quickly on that, do you, with your pasture mixes, do you sow it as a multi-species with lucerne, or do you go a monocrop first and then oversow later?
So we've done a little bit of both. Probably the most success has been where we've actually just had the lucerne in right at the start and then gone and put in some other form of pasture over the top of it to give that lucerne a little bit more time to establish. But then in saying that, some of our stands were put in as a mix, and if the autumn's been kind and the winter's been kind and we can let them get well established, they seem to have gone fairly well.
Yeah. No, very good. So we'll shift gears a little bit. So a big award last year for the Beef Farmer of the Year, and you touched briefly on correcting your soils just then. You did a Nuffield Scholarship. When was that, and what did you actually research in that scholarship?
Yes, I was awarded a Nuffield Scholarship in 2002, and the subject that I chose to look at was alternative sources of nutrient for pasture and cropping. And so for those that aren't familiar with a Nuffield Scholarship, you go through a state application process. If you get through that, then you go through a federal application selection process. And that year there was seven of us in Australia that were awarded scholarships, and you travel together as a group for the first about four weeks and actually just have a very quick around the world trip and look at agriculture, not necessarily looking at the topic you're interested in, but you do that as a group, and then after that you go off and do your own private study.
So your application was with your topic in mind?
It was with my topic in mind.
But then you travel a quick little junket, we'll call it,
that's
around
right,
the world?
Around the world for about 4 or 5 weeks.
To open your eyes and minds up, maybe?
And that's really just to put that group of people together and just to get a snapshot of what's happening within the world within agriculture.
Yeah. Did anyone strike you as more along the path than you thought?
So it was interesting. We started in Indonesia and then into the Philippines. So, some very simplistic farming systems we saw. And then we were straight out of the Philippines and straight into California. And you pop off the plane in California and off you go. And the first thing you realise is they've got 6,000 miles of concrete canaled waterways.
Right.
And what seems to be unlimited water. It didn't sort of matter what crop they wanted to grow. They had the heat units there to grow it. They had the water units to grow it, and they could grow anything. Then we were across into Europe, and so then into a very traditional type farming system. I think to answer your question, there was nowhere in particular that really stood out because it was such a vast contrast from one to the other. But what it really made me realise was that Australia at that stage, and I think still even now, has so much underdeveloped country.
Yeah.
So soils and properties and regions which have so much development potential in front of them still that it's probably beyond the imagination of a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that because of our location? We're just so far from what we can see as possible?
I think we've always had this thought pattern in Australia that we've actually just got so much land that we really don't have to put the infrastructure and the development into our land because there's just millions of acres of it.
Yeah.
Now, that's changed in the last few years, I think, as we've started to see, a lot of the multinational companies coming in, buying big parcels of Australia, realising that our land has been probably very cheap compared to what land's been worth in other parts of the world. We've got a very very stable environment in the respect of political environment, market environment to grow and market commodities. So Australia is probably at the cusp, I think, of the next round of development, and because there's no more land to be developed, it'll mean development within businesses. And so further infrastructure, further development into soils, and just in generally increasing the productivity of our country.
Yep. That's interesting. So we'll go back to the actual scholarship. I diverted there, sorry. What did you actually study? You studied alternative...
Yeah, so I studied alternative sources of nutrient for pasture and cropping.
Yeah.
So what I was really looking for was whether there was byproducts that were coming out of industry, byproducts coming out of other processing facilities that were very useful sources of fertility. Where I probably landed was so much of these byproducts that come out are only of use to someone that is in close proximity to that plant.
Yeah.
So freight is always one of the major issues, because lots of times these byproducts that come out have a relatively low nutrient value, but because they're a byproduct and sometimes got negligible cost associated to them, the freight can be the largest cost.
Yeah.
So really where I come to the conclusion that poultry manure was probably the best byproduct that was locally available within our Gippsland region. And as there was sort of a large amount of poultry sheds and broiler sheds all down through east of Melbourne, it was it was the product that I probably become more and more interested in, and how that commodity can be used. Probably some of the different ways of actually getting the fertility out of the poultry manure into your soils, and get it activated.
Yeah, and from what I understand too, with poultry manure, it's not just the actual nutrient value. You also get a microbial input as well.
It's really a strong point there, Al. I can remember meeting up with a professor called H.L. Goodwin in Arkansas University, and he'd been studying poultry manure for his entire career, and he was very near retirement age. And he said, Trevor, I've come to the conclusion, he said, if we could put a value on microbial activity, he said there's probably more dollar value in the microbial activity in a tonne of poultry manure than there is in the actual NPKs out of the poultry manure. And he went back to work that they'd done on the Mississippi Delta Plains in the very early days of laser levelling in the 1950s and 60s. And he said what appeared to be the same soil, 10-foot deep topsoils, and he said, and we'd go and cut like 3 or 4 foot off one end of the paddock to actually try and get the water to run. And those areas where we took the deep cuts, he said we could never get the crops to perform in those areas. And so he said we would have more soil tested up. He said that the analysis would say that the soil was just as fertile there as the other end. And he said then one day, someone said, I wonder what would happen if we tried some poultry manure on those areas where we've done the deep cuts. And within 12 months, with poultry manure applied to those areas with deep cuts, all of a sudden they were as productive as the rest of the paddock.
Right.
So he very much said it just must have been the microbial activity that was introduced. It inoculated the soil with microbes and bugs.
Yeah. How long ago was this conversation?
So this conversation was in 2003 that I had with HL. Yeah.
So, and I know that soil science has come a long way in the last 2 decades, so we might be starting to actually understand why that happens, not just anecdotally.
Exactly, not just an observation that he'd made as a soil person.
Yeah.
And he would have been very early in his career in the 1950s and 60s. But it's something that has always stuck with me, that especially when we're developing properties up through East Gippsland here on the Red Gum Plains, that if we've got a very light sand-textured soil, that some poultry manure right at the start when we start developing those places always seems to actually get that inoculation happening and get those properties
Wake it all
up and going.
So from that scholarship, how has this changed your farming practices? You obviously still spread a lot of chicken litter, I know.
Yep.
So you're seeing the economics both with soil health and animal health. Where have you gone from that scholarship in your farming practices?
Yeah, so probably the scholarship, I'll back up a little bit. I think one thing that the scholarship did do personally for myself was it probably gave me a greater confidence in my decision-making ability to actually look at situations. Because I'd seen so many different farming systems throughout the world that I had something to fall back onto to actually recall a situation that I'd seen. And then the other great part of it is the alumni that you create within the other Nuffield scholars. You've generally always got someone somewhere that you can give a call to and have a talk about a subject. Yeah. And so that helps enormously. But the poultry manure now, we used to cart. We had a truck basically running full-time carting poultry manure, and that's the biggest limitation, is just trying to get the tonnages carted that you need, because you need to be sort of putting 1.5, 2 tonne to the hectare on to really get some benefit.
It's quite light too, isn't it?
That's right. Yeah. So it's a very light commodity. Like a B double, you might get 100 cubic metres on, and a single trailer you might get 60 cubic metres on. Yeah. We're to the point now where we actually really only use the poultry manure when we've got a cultivation process going on. So in the past, we have just spread a lot of poultry manure on the surface of our pastures, and that's done a great job. But you definitely get a far greater benefit if you've got some cultivation going on, and you can actually get that poultry manure cultivated in through the top 100 mil.
Yep, keeping those microbials alive, you think? Or?
I think you're keeping them alive, and I think probably the other aspect of it is you're limiting the volatilisation from the poultry manure.
Yeah.
So if you go and put poultry manure on an open pasture and you just don't happen to get rain for the first probably week, you probably lost a fair bit of that nitrogen, because you've sort of got to remember with poultry manure, you got about 2/3 of it's an ammonium nitrate and 1/3 of it's an organic nitrate.
Yeah.
So the organic nitrate, that'll be fantastic, that'll stay there, but the ammonium nitrate you will lose. But if you cultivated it straight in a couple of hours later, you've probably limited those losses of the ammonium nitrate to something very, very minuscule. Yeah.
So going forward, your Nuffield Scholarship taught you a lot, opened your farming philosophy up, question everything, but make decisive decisions. What now is the next thing that you're working on, or I guess you see around our area? What is the thing that is holding our soils back?
Look, we've got, as you'd know, El, your family's farmed here for a long time. Once we get off the good river flats or anything like that, we have a very light soil, generally a very low CEC, that has very minimal calcium, sometimes a little bit of excessive magnesium, very low phosphoruses, very low potashes, sulphurs, and then nearly all the trace elements that you look at are generally low. About the only one of those elements that's not low is normally iron, which we have a lot of iron in these soils, which is of negligible value to us. So I suppose we're very much focused on how do we try and balance our soils. And when I say balance them, we very much farm on the principles of William Albrecht's Albrecht theory. So William Albrecht was a soil scientist back in the 1930s and 40s all through America. And what he achieved through his lifetime was quite amazing, because not only was he a soil scientist, but he was a great observer. So William initially noticed that of all of the young people coming in to the Army and the Navy and such through World War II in the States, certain areas where those people come from, they would either have issues with bone structure, they would have issues with their teeth, and he wondered what it was all about, and then very much realised that in that era, everyone ate out of their local environment. So if you were eating out of your local environment, the food was probably grown within 50 miles around you. Then he'd come to the conclusion that that must mean that if those soils are, say, calcium deficient, perhaps that's why we're having more bone issues with certain individuals out of those areas. So it was an observation that then drew him in to the science of it. And that's when he actually started doing a lot of soil testing and come to the realisation that a lot of America had some of these quite large deficiencies within their soils as well, and it was coming through in the food stuff. And hence, that was what was creating people that were had certain health ailments.
So did he go back then and try and correct some of the soils and retest?
Yeah, so in between all of this, he actually spent some time travelling the whole world, pulling soil samples of what he thought was probably some of the most productive soils throughout the world, and took them back to his lab and actually analysed them all, and come to the realisation that there are some really common elements of ratios of elements from everywhere that actually had the best of the soils. And the common ratios tended to be that they were approximately 65% calcium within the cation, about 12% magnesium, probably 5% potash, and then that left a little bit for hydrogen and sodium. And so then when he started looking at the trace elements, come to the realisation that everywhere that's growing the healthiest soil actually had some common minimums as far as the trace elements go. And that's where you sort of start to get your principles that we work by, which with your trace elements, and you start in this soil type of ours at the moment, New property we're just working on at the moment, I think it's soil tested up. Coppers have come back at half a part per million. And,
where do we want to see them?
And we really need to be a minimum of 2 parts per million.
Right, and so you got 1.5 parts to get up over your 2 parts.
Yeah.
How much copper do we have to put on a hectare?
Yeah, we've probably
to
got
move it, or is it probably a complicated equation? Is it or
It's
not?
it's not particularly complicated. You do need to establish what the CEC of the soil is first. So that's basically the clay content, how heavy the soil is. Now this soil that we're working with at the moment is a CEC of about 9, so that's pretty standard through here. You'll need a minimum of 10 kilos per hectare of copper sulphate to get you probably up to 1.5 parts per million.
Right.
So we would ideally go in over 2 years with 10 kilos, and then we go another 10 kilos the following year. And that'll land you at about 2.5 to 3 parts per million.
Yep. So is that a linear equation? Does it just, you put on your 10 kilos every year, it jumps up by
that
1 part, or does it tailor off?
It would tailor off to some extent. From our experience up to now, and also budget constraints, we're really just looking to gain these minimums.
Right.
So if we can get our coppers to a minimum of 2 parts per million, our zincs at probably 8 parts per million, manganese is up there probably at about 40 to 50 parts per million. And then you've got your other elements like boron and selenium. And unfortunately, boron doesn't stay in the system very well, so it's a very mobile element. So whatever you put on, which you might go and put 8 or 10 kilos to the hectare on, you probably need to budget in that in 3 years' time you'll need to be doing that again.
Interesting point, because I remember reading a book, couldn't give you the author, but he went around, bought lots of farms, renovated them, and there was one patch of ground on this whole farm that had what he would call nearly perfect soil.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't figure out why, because there was no difference between undulation or anything like that. He found out that 50 years ago there was a pigsty there.
Yeah, right.
And so after 5 decades,
Yep.
those traces were still in very, very good balance, apart from, did you say boron?
Yeah, boron's very mobile. So of all the elements, we always, if you can try and remember that nitrogen, sulfur and boron are the most mobile elements.
Yeah.
So they're the 3 that you'll always have to be addressing on a continuous basis. Whereas the rest of the elements, you do have a fair chance of building them in reserve.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, Al, about that where the piggery landed, because I had similar experiences when I was in my Nuffield in the UK. I can remember standing in a field with a very elderly farmer and just complimenting him on what an amazing soil type he had here. And he said, well, look, he said, this actually was probably our poorest paddock. But he said, all we did, all after the war years, he said, we had lots of cows in barns. And he said, we just focused on all of the manure than the barnyard waste that come out of those barns, just went onto these poorer soils. And he said, they've just turned them from a very shallow soil to a very deep, rich soil. So manures are quite amazing.
Yeah, I was talking to a English guy the other day, and they call it blacking out a paddock, apparently.
Yep.
They pour that much on that the paddock goes black.
Yeah.
There must be quite a bit there. They're putting through there. So, here locally, and is this true for all coastal sort of regions? We're going to be down in copper, zinc.
Look, everything I've seen, it doesn't matter whether you're farming on the sand plains in Esperance in Western Australia, or you're in that southeastern South Australia corner, all the way through here to Gippsland, South Gippsland as well. Generally, your trace elements are all on the low side. Yeah. Now, the most important thing always is go and get some good soil tests taken, and just see where you are, and then you can make some really informed decisions. The last thing someone would want to do would be to go and start making the big capital investment in trace elements without knowing what their baselines are. And I'd sort of suggest more than just 1 year of soil tests. I'd probably like to see 2 or 3 years of soil tests that show you that you've got a genuine problem there, unless you've had some very strong previous history and knowledge in the region, and you can actually just sometimes walk into paddocks now and look at them and go, well, I think, there's pretty much this is what they're going to need to get them going. But probably something if you're going to go to that cost of getting your trace elements sorted out, you just can't forget the calcium that needs to go with it.
Yeah.
So, like, we prioritise when we're starting to develop a property. We're always aiming to get the calcium sorted out very first. So that would probably be initially like 3 tonne of lime to the hectare, and then most likely coming back after a couple of years when we've done some more soil testing with another 1.5 or 2 tonne just to top them up. Most of our country now has probably had 6 tonne of lime to the hectare over it.
Yeah.
And then you can't forget your phosphorus, because really calcium and phosphorus are the 2 drivers of plant growth. And then naturally your nitrogen just needs to come along, on a regular basis. And I think the other element that people really have taken their eye off the ball is sulphur, because everyone used to use single superphosphate, and sulphur was just the byproduct that you got with single super. Whereas now there's a lot of high analysis fertiliser used, and so sulphur can be really quite limiting. And from what I'm sort of gleaning, from some of the key agronomists around the world, you probably nearly should be aiming for the same levels of sulphur in your soils as what your phosphorus is. So probably a 1-to-1 ratio, which is substantially more than probably what most of our soils ever see at the moment. Our way of going about sulphur in the last few years has been we're carting gypsum out of northern Victoria. Yeah. So now that we've got our soils where the calciums are up to about 62% calcium, we don't really need a lot of lime in there. So we can actually just use gypsum to actually top up that last little bit of available calcium that we need. But then we have the added advantage that we're actually getting a good sulphur source coming in the gypsum as well.
Yeah.
So that will really just keep those levels fairly luxurious.
Yep. Why do we want our soils balanced? Not only to grow more, but I'm assuming there's a big animal health aspect to it.
Yeah, look, I believe to be able to finish livestock properly without huge amounts of supplementary feeding, it's basically essential to get your soils balanced. So once you've got those trace elements in there and you've got your calciums up fairly right, what you just tend to find is a lot of the incidences of just your common issues with cattle, especially like pink eye and such, will start to disappear. So pink eye, I strongly believe, is a trace element deficiency.
Of which one? We've got a vet coming in next week.
There you go. So I believe it's a combination of copper and selenium.
Yeah.
And probably a little bit of cobalt as well. My observation is that if you can keep the eyes dry on the animals, you tend to basically not get any pink eye. Once you start to, if you see a mob of cattle going through and they've actually got some watery eyes, because we've addressed all of the coppers and zincs and manganeses and all of our blood tests in our animals say that we're pretty good there, but we haven't addressed the selenium and the cobalt. So cobalt is vitamin B12. We tend to find that one shot of B12 plus selenium under the skin and you'll just about dry the eyes up overnight on animals.
Right.
And once you've dried the eyes up, you
infection
basically your infection just seems to disappear.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of work to be done in this space of livestock issues that I believe are actually trace element deficiencies, but showing up as livestock health issues.
Is someone working on this at the minute? Because it doesn't seem like there's a direct link often between these two.
No, look, I don't think there's probably the work being done that needs to be done. And I suppose you've got to remember that there's a lot more money in developing a vaccine for pink eye or a vaccine for something else than there ever is in marketing some trace elements.
Yeah.
So trace elements are fairly much a raw commodity. The way we buy them, just copper bluestone and such that we spread straight out on the soils. There's no real big multinational company there that's got a cartel over that. It's you buy it through whoever you can get a good price on the day. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
It's all back to money, doesn't it? Right, now you're obviously a thinker. an innovator, and so it's no surprise that you're actually involved in the Gippsland Agriculture Group. We're not actually just involved in the Gippsland Agriculture Group. You're part of the formation of that. Is that correct?
It was. So Gippsland Ag Group was an idea driven from about half a dozen of us that had some conversations back in like 2018, 2019, that wouldn't it be great if we could actually have a local research group that would be not only a research group to sort of try and drive the next level of productivity in our Gippsland region, but also something that would create a network of farmers that could come together and share ideas, share different functions, where we basically learn off each other. I have a bit of a theory, Al, that the collective knowledge of your leading farmers within the region probably far exceeds the knowledge that we hold within all of our teaching and research universities and such. Because if you actually start talking to some of the leading farmers and see how they've addressed certain issues and such, it's generally quite left field sometime, but they've actually generally got a very good result. They've had lots of failures, but like we shouldn't be concerned about failures because you're always learning something from anything that you fail on. And so the only time you don't learn something from failure is when you don't keep moving forward and try and sort it out. So yeah, Gippsland Ag, I've got a bit, is probably, we called a public meeting down in Sale just to see whether there was any interest. There was about 100 farmers from throughout Gippsland turned up at that public meeting, which was just amazing. So Gippsland Agriculture Group was formed and incorporated at that time. And yeah, the group's just had an amazing growth phase in the last 5 or 6 years. And
and the latest venture is this podcast that we're actually sitting down to today. So what are some of the other things that you see is quite interesting or going to be quite valuable that we're currently doing right now on farm?
Look, as far as within the Gippsland Ag Research Farm, I'm just so enjoying not only the traditional stuff that whereas our cereal trials and such, which are really challenging ourselves because your cereal trials here at the farm, Al, are far exceeding what we're achieving on a yield basis within our own paddocks. So,
now, I'll let the cat out of the bag because I think this is going to go to air after the Red Meat Conference, but I think we actually had something over 10 tonne. It might have even been 11 tonne. Is that correct?
I did hear a little story, a little whisper.
Just one of the plots, but the average will come back. But I know Casey, our agronomist, is very pleased with that in a very, very challenging autumn sowing and springtime, actually very wet.
Extremely challenging. And when you start to think like 11 tonne to the hectare in our environment, like that's a UK type yield. That's amazing. So look, I've always enjoyed the cereal stuff, but I'd sort of the pasture work that's being done. Like I've always been struggled with farming in this East Gippsland environment. How do we maintain good pastures over a long period of time? We tend to get them up, we get them established, and they'll look really strong for the first 1 or 2 seasons, and then they'll actually start to taper off. So the pasture work's always been of great interest. One of the projects, I guess, that I'm really passionate about is the Growing More Topsoil project. So that's a project where we've had 3 different organisations have come together with different recommendations of how we could potentially actually increase the depth of our topsoil. So between some ameliorant products being put on and then some deep ripping to actually try and lift a little bit of clay and mix it in through the topsoil, we're starting to see some really interesting results, aren't we, Al, as far as those topsoils go? Yeah,
and quite difference between the controls or anything that's had some form of work done to it has showed improvement. I was actually out digging pits in the excavator and noticed the firmness of the virgin ground or the control ground compared to anything that had some sort of ameliorants done to it. And the interest from our farming community has been very strong. So it's obviously something that people are really interested in. The cost of property to go out and the availability is reducing, like you said before, and so being able to go down. And I think that not only the benefits of being able to grow more, but the health of that soil as well, like we're talking about, is improving the more we work on it. So
I think it was a real. I think there's a lot of wisdom in where the funding come from there. So Gippsland Food and Fibre through the drought node funded Gippsland Ag on that project, and I think they got their excitement from. We are trying to do a project that actually increases the water holding capacity of those soils, and hence when we run into a droughty year, it actually may allow that crop to actually go for another 2 or 3 weeks and get over the line, because we've actually got a deeper soil and we've got some more moisture held there and some increase in nutrient. So I think full credence to the drought node there for funding that, because I think it's a project that we could see eventually changes the face of a lot of the red gum plains.
Yeah, no, it's exciting time for that project. We're a year and a bit in, and is it a 5-year?
A 5-year project.
A 5-year project. So stay tuned for updates along the way there. Now, what do you see? Gippsland can be quite volatile to farm in. Some of it is just pure weather, which we can't control a whole lot of. What are some other limiting factors of our region? What is holding us back as farmers?
Look, I think to a fair degree, you would have to say lack of capital within a lot of businesses. So most businesses, when I sort of look around Gippsland, they need a serious investment in infrastructure, and that infrastructure may be more silos, hay sheds, silage bunkers, just infrastructure that actually puts more reserves on the property. As you know, Al, it's just not unusual for us to drop into 4 or 5 months where it just decides it doesn't want to rain, sort of can quite often happen on a lot of the east coast of Australia. So hence, to keep your farming system functioning and travelling along as per normal, you actually need to be able to have the reserves on hand, that you just say, okay, it's bad luck, we're not going to graze out of the paddocks for the next few months, but we're going to have to graze out of the silo or the hay shed or the silage bunker. So I think that's something that really needs to be dealt with. We've got all these soil issues that we've talked about. Now that again is just capital and a desire from people and a confidence within their own farming system to actually have the confidence to invest that capital into their soils to get them up and going. I think the other real issue that we're probably looming with is within our red meat processing and our red meat farming systems is actually a lack of kill capacity in this central and East Gippsland region. So we have some major businesses right here in East Gippsland. When you think about Paddy's Foods for one, the quantity of beef that they would be using through there on a daily basis, I would suggest could sustain the backbone of a small abattoir in our region, just basically taking old cows through that. And once you actually had a small processing facility that could be supplying beef into likes of a local processor like Paddy's, you then actually free up some capacity for some more specialised kills to be done for your local butcher shops. We have a small abattoir at Orbost, and he just does a great job with the capacity that he's got. But Gippsland has a fairly large population, and he's got a fairly limited capacity. So that's something that I really think, as an industry, we need to be looking at seriously. How do we get some kill capacity here in this region? So
how does that help our farmers? Is it just the cost of sending them, or is it the ability to book them into things?
Look, I think it's I think it'll be twofold. I think as we develop another market for our animals here, right at our doorstep, naturally it takes away some freight issues and things like that. I think it opens the opportunity for some providence marketing to happen. So providence marketing, can be very successful if done well, and that is something that, without having the kill capacity here, it's very, very hard to do.
Yeah.
then once you've got the kill capacity there, you then go into boning rooms and things like that. The employment spin-off would be substantial. And I think the general uplift in economic conditions for the region tends to always flow down.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter. At the moment, I feel like we export a lot of our dollars out of the region for someone else to take profit out of. And I guess I'd love to see some of those dollars staying in our region.
Yeah. No, we'll keep talking about it, and hopefully we can, because I know, it's cost us $7 a head for sheep the other week to send down to Ballarat. Doesn't sound like a whole lot for one animal, but when you're doing thousands a year, it adds up very quickly. Okay, well, that I think comes to the end of our official thing. But while we've got you here, we've actually got a listener question, and they were wanting to know some decision-making times around autumn sowing. So how do you approach your autumn sowing plan?
Yeah. So look, we love to get some country literally sprayed out and fallowed, and that would have happened like probably 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So around about Christmas probably, and early in the new year. So, and our decisions there are around if it's a paddock that's in good shape and it hasn't been pugged, and it's not full of stump holes, we're more than happy just to spray them out, fallow them, and get them ready to direct drill any time from now on. If it's a paddock that...
Are you a dry sower?
We will, yes. Yep. No, we sow by the calendar. So we have certain dates on the calendar. We believe that all of our grazing type crops need to be in the ground by the middle of March.
Yep.
So we'll just get going probably the last week in February and just start planting. And then any of our pastures will try and go in towards the end of March, and then we'll be going into...
Were you in moisture, or are you happy to dry sow the pastures as well?
I really would like to see some moisture for the pastures, and that probably just comes down to the cost of pasture seed. So when with our fodder crops, a lot of them are either an oats or a grazing wheat or something like that. So we probably haven't quite got the cost in seed that we do with the pastures. Any of those crops that are going in early, we do like to have some arrowleaf clover going in with all of them. Now that's just a little bit disappointing when that comes up and then gets burnt off, because it generally is a very shallow root system at the start. But it's something that I think we just have to take the risk, because there's always a few plants survive.
Yeah, it doesn't grow in the shed, I've been told.
It doesn't grow in the shed, and we're just a huge fan of arrowleaf clover. It just is such a prolific seeder, and the stock do such a good job at spreading it around. I don't know why anyone would plant anything in Central or East Gippsland without having a couple of kilos of arrowleaf clover thrown in with it.
Yeah.
It just grows. It literally grows like a weed.
Right.
Yeah.
And what's your mix between your annuals and perennials sowing?
Yeah, look, it's it just comes down to what parcels of country we got and what stage they're at in development and such. We try and have like 100 hectares or so of perennial pastures, new perennial pastures going in each year.
Yep.
Just part of the rotation to try and keep those pastures.
What's that as a percentage, actually? Would probably be better.
Yeah, so we sort of farm around about 4,000 acres, so about sort of 1,700 hectares. So it's not a very big percentage.
Yeah,
like it's only 5-8% or something.
Yeah.
Annuals have probably been a big part of our production system, because they're quick. Direct drilling has become fairly efficient over the years, and you can sort of drill a lot of country in a couple of days. But it's all another cost, and it's all another process that you have to manage as well.
Yeah.
So the spraying out and such. Just touching on that, those decisions around early sowing, like we are not afraid to cultivate up some paddocks if we think they're not in good shape.
Yeah.
So if you can't drive over it in the ute 60 k's an hour, it needs cultivating.
My whole farm needs cultivating.
We're shockers like that.
Yeah.
Yep. got to have smooth paddocks. Then when the spreaders run and come in to spread your fert and everything like that, everything's so efficient because you can do it. I hate wrecking boom sprays. So that's our bit of a thing. And sometimes with that cultivation, we're not adverse to a little bit of deep ripping as well. We'll quite often walk around with a probe and just try and get a bit of an idea of our compaction levels, and compaction's sort of always a bit of an issue.
Yeah. And what about fert with that? Do you fairly traditional 80 or 100 kilos?
Yeah, so we're probably, if we're going to go with an MAP or a DAP, our preference would be an MAP.
Yeah.
Probably think we get a better result out of an MAP, and I think the form of phosphorus is a little bit more suited to our soils. Then sometimes if it's a crop that we're not particularly passionate about, we quite often will just throw a bit of single super under it.
Yeah.
And we don't always direct drill with a seed drill. We actually sometimes, with our cultivated country, we will actually just spin the fertiliser and the seed out on top of the cultivated soil and then just pull a big set of disc chains over it.
Yeah.
And the disc chains will just basically do a little cultivation 1 to 2 inches deep, and that'll just stir the soil and the seed and the fert together.
Rolling that after? Or
quite often, if there's a clover or something going in on top, we'll roll it. Now, to put the clover on, you'll either have to put it in the spreader truck and spin it out with a little bit more fert, or we have got a drone now. Toby's got a drone, so that's a great way to put your couple of kilos of clover out, is just put the drone over the paddock and then just put the Cambridge rollers over after that, and you'll have a beautiful result just with rolling the clover into the top.
Yep. Oh, very good. Now, our last question, our signature question is, what have you learnt recently that has surprised you? Here at Gippsland Ag, we're always learning, but we're not always surprised. But what is something that has surprised you that you've learnt recently?
This probably doesn't surprise me, but it's something that's become more and more evident as I've got older. And I do love observing situations and observing people and businesses and such. My conclusion is that very few people can run a successful business that has more than 2 enterprises in it.
Yeah.
I look around, and I've been guilty of it myself, and try and spread ourselves across 3 or 4 enterprises, and we start to actually do a fairly average job at most of them, bring ourselves back to 2 enterprises, and in our business we believe that's cattle and dryland cropping.
Yeah.
And I think you can actually do a fairly good job. So that's probably more of an observation that has become more and more evident to me over time, that it's, you're probably better to focus on the couple of 2 things that you think you can do well than spread yourself everywhere.
Yeah. It's a good one to finish on. Thanks very much, Trevor, for coming in. Well, it's actually 38 degrees outside, so it wasn't hard to call you in today. But
it was an easy decision, Hal.
Yeah, in the air conditioner. But thank you very much, and I'm sure the listeners really enjoy hearing from you.
Thanks very much, Hal. Good on you.
A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.